Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Walter Edwards. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and my role here is really just to thank the people in the audience for attending and to thank Jessica Robbins for allowing the center the privilege of launching her very scholarly book, and Professor Sarah Lamb for agreeing to moderate it. But I say that the idea for this program is entirely Professor Lublin's work. She brought this idea to the Humanities Center's advisory board, and it was immediately embraced. And we have had 3 quite successful book launches so far. And this program seems to be something that the humanities community and the arts and social sciences community as well is very happy about. So thank you all for coming, and I know that we can look forward to a very scholarly conversation around the book, Aging Nationally in Contemporary Poland. So it is my pleasure to hand the proceedings over to the event moderator, Professor Elizabeth Lublin.
Thank you very much, Walter. It's a pleasure to see you all here, to welcome you onto this Zoom format. As Walter mentioned, we began this virtual book launch program last winter. This is our 4th so far, our 2nd of the semester. Stephen Christomalis actually was one of our featured speakers in the winter term. And I see that Michael Kroll, who was on the selection committee for the proposals for this term, is here. I also want to do a shout out to Karen Marrero. You may say her name. She's my colleague who got this whole thing rolling, actually, since it was her book launch that popped the idea into my mind. I appreciate the Humanities Center's willingness to run with this. And certainly both to Walter and Jacqueline for doing as much work as they did behind the scenes in getting this all ready and doing the advertising and whatnot. As you know, today we are here to celebrate Jess's publication from Rutgers University Press, Aging Nationally in Contemporary Poland. Thank you very much, Jess, for being willing to share your work with us. And also Sarah from Brandeis University, thank you also for helping us to learn more about this book, more about its significance, its context, its contextualization through your questions and comments, which will be forthcoming. I know you all didn't sign in to listen to me talk, so I'm going to very briefly go through the order of the program for today so that you have a heads up of how we're going to proceed, and then I will turn things over first to Sarah. So the plan for the day is for Sarah, as our moderator, provide a brief introduction to Jess and the work. And then Jess is going to talk to us for maybe 30 minutes or so. She has a great PowerPoint that might include, her comments might include a reading from the book, all intended to help us learn more about this scholarship, since some of us may not have yet had a chance to delve very deeply into it. After Jess finishes her portion, Sarah will pick up again with comments and some questions for maybe 15-20 minutes, and then we will open things up to a question and answer session. To make things easiest, as at least my screen is now fully populated, and I know that handling the chat and looking at faces can be a bit tricky when you get to certain numbers, please feel free to include any comments in the chat. But if you have questions, if you would raise your hand either physically or using the reaction button to raise your hand, that would be great. Sarah will be then moderating the Q&A and going through the hands as she sees them in order. So there you have it. Without further ado, let me turn things over to Sarah.
Hey, well, first let me say thank you to all of you who organized this exciting event through the Humanities Center at Wayne State University. And I'm just thrilled and delighted to be here to help celebrate Jessica Robbins' really important book, really quite a beautiful, remarkable book that really makes a very significant contribution to the field of anthropology, social, cultural, gerontology, also Eastern European and Polish studies. So it's just exciting to be part of this. As many or most of you know, then Jessica Robbins is a social cultural anthropologist, also a cultural gerontologist at Wayne State University in the Department of Anthropology and the Institute of Gerontology. And she is one of the leading emerging scholars of aging and anthropology in the US and around the world. She and several others of this newer generation of anthropologists have done a lot to make people realize how exciting and fruitful aging is as a lens, not only to understand old age itself in places around the world that we're all experiencing population aging, but as a lens into understanding really other important things. For instance, in this book really highlights ideas about nationalism, memory, what it is to be a good person, a moral person, people's ideas about how old age fits into the life course or doesn't. A lot of popular discourse tries to, deny that old age is something that is meaningful and has value, and Jess's important work really contributes to that international dialogue, trying to push beyond the binaries of a good and a bad old age. Showing that even in times of frailty or advanced old age, the people that she hung out with and researched in Poland find to find meaning, vibrant social connections, and as she puts it, it expands our imaginary about what old age can be. So she's going to tell you much more about the book. I just wanted to, as my intro, point out a few things that I find really so remarkable and inspiring about it. So she did a few years of intimate ethnographic field work for the project in Poland in several sites that are really meaningful in terms of understanding aging, how it's experienced in Poland, including universities of the third age, which are very popular in Europe and in Poland, lifelong learning centers. And then also, which emphasize a kind of active aging, but in a kind of Polish version. And then also two long-term care institutions where people are experiencing more frailty and need care, but look at the intimate social relationships that go on there. And then also a daycare center for people with Alzheimer's disease. And then forms of aging in the neighborhoods and communities, like in garden plots and parish clubs. And through all this, you really see the intimate field work and relationships that Jess was able to develop with her interlocutors, many of them she followed over a period of many years. And the writing just really brings all these relationships to life. Every chapter begins with a narrative to draw you in, and we meet all these real people and we see how they interact with each other. She looks at the rhythms of daily life and how these everyday routines of things like feeding others, being hospitable, but also maybe cases where you need to be fed or toileted or bathed or washed, how people engage in conversations with each other, even if they have dementia, but still are interacting with each other meaningfully, maybe by singing songs about the past. All these daily routines, we get to feel what it's like to be living in Poland here. And through them, she also shows how aging itself sheds light on things like profound social cultural change, what Poland is as a nation, and the kinds of profound changes it's gone through in the past. So she writes about how she doesn't want to set up a binary between like phenomenological everyday experiences of aging and these larger questions about what a nation is, what a good society is, how old age, how can fit into people's notions of, how to be a modern Pole as well. And I think one thing that's really maybe one of the most important take-home points from the book is how Jess really, through her ethnography, pushes beyond this notion that there is a binary between an implicit good old age and a bad old age. So, for instance, people around the world in the proliferating, active, successful aging discourse tend to suggest that as long as you can be fit and healthy and learning and cognitively fit, then that you've had a good old age. And she very powerfully argues that also people who enter into what is sometimes called the real old age or fourth age of more frailty are also participating in meaningful forms of sociality. And as she puts it, this is giving us a much more expansive gerontological imaginary, helping, as she writes, expand the imaginative possibility for living a valued life in one's final decades. And I was going to read a favorite passage from the book, but maybe I should turn it over to Jess first, and then if there's time, then I will. But yeah, so it's just been a really delight and a pleasure to be able to read the book more carefully now, and that Jess can share this important work with us. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that really kind and fantastically generous introduction to the book. Thank you so much to Walter and Betsy for hosting this today, and to the staff of the Humanities Center for making everything run smoothly. I'm so glad to be here today and to be able to share this book with you. Let me take just a minute and share my screen here so I can get my slides going. Okay. Does that work? Can you all see them?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. So yes, thank you again, everyone, for being here today. So I'm so delighted to have a chance to talk with you about my new book today. I'll give a brief overview of the talk that's to follow before getting into it. So first, I'll describe a bit of the demographic and policy context of aging populations. Then I'll talk about global imaginaries of old age, as Sarah has already introduced, in which the active aging and third age, these times of supposed health and contributing to society, are opposed to a supposed fourth age, a time of illness and decline. Next, I'll share just a bit about the theoretical framework and methodology. Then I'll share a few stories from the book about how older Poles make meaningful connections between their own lives and the Polish nation. And I'll close with just a few remarks about the broader implications of the book. Like other countries in Europe, Poland's population is growing proportionally older due to a combination of increasing life expectancies and decreasing birth rates. Such demographic change poses challenges for policymakers who often understand population aging as a factor that puts a strain on social service, healthcare, and pension systems. So in order to lessen the burden, both financial and social, of aging populations, something called active aging is becoming increasingly popular globally. These discourses and programs encourage older adults to learn new skills, remain in the workforce, become socially engaged, and practice health-promoting behaviors. Active aging was defined by the WHO in 2002 as the, quote, process of optimizing opportunities for health, participation, and security in order to enhance quality of life as people age. And it's related to other ideas, as Sarah mentioned, like successful aging, healthy aging, productive aging, that all aim to make aging a positive time in the life course that can include a whole range of activities, exercise, education, hobbies, volunteering, socializing. These are examples of a model of the life course in which there is a period called the third age. The third age is historically specific to demographic and political economic shifts of the second half of the 20th century in Europe and North America. And it's an idealized, imagined time in the life course when one has left the formal labor market, remains healthy, and can thus contribute to society. Universities of the third age are a key type of continuing education institution for retirees and exemplify this concept of the third age. I'll be talking about those a little bit later on in the talk. And so this image that you see here on the slide is quite representative of this third age ideal. Two older adults doing Nordic walking. They're healthy, they're physically active. It's a positive, warm picture. In Poland, active aging programs have become a new way for some older Poles to practice aktywność, activity or activeness, which is a locally meaningful way of growing old, by aligning themselves with narratives of progress. Just a note here, in the Polish language, programs promoting active aging use the word aktywność or aktywny, active, but these words are also used in other contexts. So to preserve the local meanings and histories of the word aktywność, I use the Polish word, I use this word aktywność throughout my work, and I use the English active aging only for those programs that are explicitly affiliated with active aging concepts of the past few decades, in order to keep categories of practice and analysis distinct from each other. So these meanings of active aging have to do with national history that older Poles lived through and the proper place of Poland in the world. You can see in the image on the slide here, a poster from the University of the Third Age in Wrocław, one of my field sites, that says University of the Third Age, our little homeland. Particularly important in these active aging contexts is the transition from socialism to capitalism. So part of active aging in Poland is aspiring to an old age that aligns with supposed Western ideals. So a few examples of this. A former institutional leader of the University of the Third Age in Wrocław talked about creating Euroseniorzy, or Euro seniors. This was accomplished through some practices that were pretty explicitly associated with the European Union, like taking older adults on trips to the EU Parliament in Brussels and Strasbourg and to meet their representatives. Others were less explicit, like becoming open instead of closed in an attitude toward the world, interested in learning new skills and meeting new people. In an NGO called Active Senior, where active is spelled with an @ sign, participants were taught how to use ATMs and invest in the stock market, and also to take responsibility for one's own health, as opposed to being passive and following directions from doctors. Both institutional leaders and older Poles themselves associated these activities as a transition away from the socialist past and towards a kind of individual and national belonging in the EU and the world. So it seems here like active aging maps onto stories of the post-socialist transition. However, the histories of these institutions suggest it's not such a simple transition story. Universities of the Third Age are indeed proliferating in contemporary Poland, and some do receive funding that stems directly from US civil society building initiatives in Eastern Europe. However, these institutions date back to the 1970s, the socialist period, when there were also concerns about the burdens of an aging population. So this historical perspective suggests a more complex story. So the opposite of active aging always looms. The very need to transform aging into something that's active or healthy or successful or productive suggests that it inherently isn't these things. So the possibilities of illness, debility, decline, dependency, isolation, they always loom, accompanied by the often unspoken knowledge of the certainty of death. Indeed, scholars conceive of the Third Age as followed by the, quote, Fourth Age of, quote, dependence and decrepitude. The image on the right here from a leading Polish newspaper is a common example of imagery representing this aspect of old age. Note that the person is alone in the hallway of what looks like institutional care. Living in institutional care can be quite stigmatized in Poland, as people would prefer to age at home with kin, even as they realize that this is often not possible for reasons of geography, work, or the physical suitability of the home itself. So I also want to say here that, of course, these third and fourth ages are ideal types, but they're important in as much as they shape cultural imaginations of what old age is like. And they're present in both global gerontological policy and policy imaginaries of old age, as well as in Poland. So what I found in my long-term fieldwork in both third and fourth age contexts was that there are actually important similarities across these seemingly divergent experiences of health and illness, independence and dependence, and connection and isolation. And these similarities emerged from looking at everyday practices. Older people were connecting with others through the telling of stories, whether these stories were about past and present suffering, that day's tour of the local flying club, pictured here on the left, or future travel plans, whether people were learning skills, whether these skills involved operating a wheelchair, walking, learning motor skills as in occupational therapy activities pictured on the right here, or people were learning English or using a computer. People were also sharing food and drink, whether in the form of styrofoam cups of coffee in a university cafeteria after a foreign language class, or afternoon snacks carried in by nurses' aides at a rehabilitation center. Through remembering, imagining, learning, and commensality, older people across these sites were forming new social relations of friendship and care. These meaningful social relations with non-kin have the power to shape the ways in which older people understand themselves and are understood by others through refashioning the connections between persons, places, and times. This interest in how everyday social relations shape people's understandings of themselves and how they're viewed by others is grounded in anthropological understandings of moral personhood and kinship. By moral personhood, I refer to an analytic category that encompasses what it means to be a social person in which some people are made to feel valued and included, while others are devalued and excluded. In contemporary Poland, as in many parts of the world, active aging and the third age can be seen as ideal forms of moral personhood in late life, whereas experiences of illness and the fourth age can diminish, dismantle, or threaten moral personhood. This is something that's created through everyday social relations and thus has empirical implications. So in order to see moral personhood in late life, the anthropologist can investigate the daily practices through which relatedness is created, maintained, or unraveled. In Poland, what I found is that these practices that shape moral personhood have spatio-temporal contours. Personhood is created across lifetimes via processes that are both intimate and vast, encompassing small-scale social interactions, historical political economy, and the moral imagination. And together, these refashion the connections between persons, places, and times. So in sum, by focusing ethnographic attention on the processes through which persons are created, maintained, and transformed, rather than on the presence of an idealized third or fourth age, it becomes possible to avoid reproducing local ideals of moral personhood in late life, and instead to create an empirically grounded understanding of moral personhood. These connections between persons, places, and times became evident in the life history stories that older Poles shared with me. Across diverse groups of older Poles and in varying contexts, people made narrative connections to the place of the Polish nation. These links to particular places and times were important for understandings of themselves as persons, their social relations, and place in the world. This has to do with the multiple, dramatic, and large-scale sociocultural, political, economic changes that have occurred during the lifetimes of the oldest generations in Poland. People who participated in the study ranged in their age from the late 50s, born in the early 1950s, to their late 90s, born in the early 1910s. The oldest individuals in my study were born before World War I, when Poland was still under partition and ruled by the Prussian, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires. They lived through World War I, the creation of the first independent Polish state since 1795, the catastrophic destruction of World War II, the imposition of state socialism by the Soviet Union, the collapse of that system in 1989, and the transformation to a democratic capitalist nation state and the joining of the European Union in 2004. This is all in one lifetime. These transformations had profound effects on people's daily lives and ways of imagining themselves. So they're not just political, economic, but also sociocultural. This also has to do with the importance of the Polish nation has to do with a contemporary political context in which the romantic, messianic national myth of the Polish nation has been mobilized by the far-right nationalist party, Law and Justice. The simplified version of this myth is that Poland has suffered oppression by foreign powers for centuries and has valiantly resisted this oppression. For centuries, Poles have fought for their own and others' freedom. These struggles would be in vain, since Poland has often lost such struggles, except that to be Polish is to be Catholic, and Poles have thus been defending Catholicism as well as Poland in these fights. Poland is a nation chosen by God to suffer, and in that suffering it finds redemption. Poland, the Christ of nations. This messianic myth can take gendered dimensions in the figure of the Matka Polka, or Mother Pole, who both protects the nation through nurturing its members and bears its suffering. This understanding of Polish nationalism is a historical construct drawing on 19th century Polish Romantic nationalist ideals that has to do more with the late 19th century and early 20th century Polish politics than how people actually understood themselves at that time. But in the contemporary Polish political world, this narrative is espoused by the far-right political parties and religious leaders as part of isolationist, conservative, and exclusionary ideologies. It is sometimes taken up practically verbatim by some older Poles, as in the case of one woman who in my study, who connected her own suffering to that of the Polish nation after the 2010 plane crash that killed the president, first lady, and 94 others. But these narrative connections between person and nation actually recur across diverse groups of older Poles and in varying contexts. And the nation comes to matter in different ways at different moments. And again, these connections to particular places and times are important for how people understand themselves, their social relations, and place in the world. So we need to take these seriously, even in the cases that seem most explicitly tied to these exclusionary far-right policies. Just a few words on methods. I did my field work in Wrocław and Poznań, two cities in Western Poland with different relationships to the history of the Polish nation. And I chose research sites that would help me understand both the so-called third and fourth ages, so a range of medical and educational institutions. Then, since these are not typical of most older Poles' experiences, I sought out more typical contexts of aging for a comparative perspective. This included older Poles who participated in allotment gardening, parish clubs at their church, and retiree groups, as well as older people who lived alone. Notably, aging in these contexts that were not explicitly about aging looked pretty similar to aging in the other contexts at the level when looking at the level of moral personhood. And I was there for 22 months between 2006 and 14, with the longest period between 2008 and 10. There were over 100 people who participated in the study. And again, I used the cultural understanding of old age rather than a chronological marker of old age to include people in the study. The majority were women, and I engaged in a range of pretty standard ethnographic methods. So now I'll get into some of the stories from the particular field sites, focusing on connections to the Polish nation. So at the University of the Third Age, some of the most popular classes were activities that were linked to the open westward orientation of Poland. Classes in computer skills and foreign language, especially English, were often oversubscribed. So I taught some conversational English classes in both Wrocław and Poznań, and people told me that they were learning English in order to communicate with their children's spouses and grandchildren in the UK. However, although these particular instances of language learning were connected to recent socio-political changes, they also resonated with older forms of sociality and education. The universities of the Third Age have been teaching foreign languages since the 70s. And these practices recall those of Polish elites learning of foreign languages during the partition era. So in other words, the practice of older Poles learning foreign languages in order to access a form of cultural prestige has a deeper history. So there's a class element to these aspirations of older Poles learning English in this context. But universities of the Third Age were actually not only about the new. People engaged in activities that they'd participated in much earlier in their lives as well, such as handicrafts and choirs. These were not commented on by leaders and participants in the same way that computer classes in English were, but they nevertheless formed an important part of the social life there. So in other words, there's continuities with the past, not only transformations into a new sort of person, such that Euro seniors are not the only kinds of personhood being nurtured at the UTAs. The national past came out in these contexts as well. And there was a cabaret group, for instance, at the UTA that performed a musical sketch about the life of Pope John Paul II. The audience received it well, clapping with great enthusiasm. At another concert, the choir in Wrocław performed songs about the city of Lwów, to which Wrocławians, especially older Wrocławians, have a special connection due to the historical links between these cities. So there's both national and regional connections that matter here. People also emphasized that they were creating new friendships at these UTAs that were different from those at other points in their lives, when people had to be friends with their coworkers and neighbors out of necessity. But here at the UTA, they emphasized that they could build relations with people that they just liked. They could just have friendships with people that they liked. And so this was something that people also associated with Poland's westward orientation. Many women at the UTAs also described that this was the first time that they could finally do something for oneself, to robić coś dla siebie, because earlier in their lives they were taking care of others and working, but now they could do something just that they wanted to. So in this context that seems to be cultivating a form of neoliberal personhood that promotes the learning of new skills and looking to the future, older Poles are actually engaging with this shared past and creating a vision of aging that highlights commonality, sociality, and collectivity. So I'll move here to a supposed fourth age context, a rehabilitation center run by Catholic nuns. I'll tell the story of one woman I called Pani Alicja, a pseudonym. Pani is the formal term of address for women in Polish. Pani Alicja was 72 when we met in 2008. While for many older Poles, the partition era was the time period that loomed the largest, she more commonly understood her present life in relation to the state socialist past. She was born in southeastern Poland before World War II and had worked as a farmer up until she had a stroke 5 months before we met, which left her reliant on a wheelchair and rendered her legs and entire left side paralyzed. She was at the rehab center for over a year while waiting for a place in a long-term care institution. And during this time, she didn't know exactly when she would be leaving or where she'd be going. She made quick transitions between her own bodily suffering and that of the Polish nation, in one breath commenting on the difficulty of the day's physical therapy session, and the next on the sad state of today's Poland, where the grocery stores are full of, quote, dirty, foreign produce, and farmers have no one to whom to sell their crops. Deeply upset by both her bodily changes and her move to institutional care, and lacking certainty about her future, her world was in flux. During this time of uncertainty, she sought to place herself in a known world, seeking connections with others by telling stories about the past. For Pani Alicja, this is where a moral life was in the past, in a time in which she and her family could make a living on the land in which people were honest. These broader spatio-temporal horizons, though, could not substitute for the loss of living in her own home among family in the village. So her case is in some ways perhaps an example of a failure of moral personhood, when connecting to the scale of the Polish nation met yet another way of experiencing loss. Yet this institution itself also shaped moral personhood through other aspects of time and place, through such everyday practices of care and intimacy, as feeding and diapering, or in one case, a couple that met, fell in love, and got engaged at a state-run social welfare home. So the cyclical temporality of the days in institutional care, I argue, produced these small-scale, intimate relations of care. And then the final story I'll tell is from the Allotment Gardens, so in more typical sites of aging rather than the third and fourth age contexts. So many people had their allotment gardens for decades. Pan Lech, the treasurer of his allotment garden in Wrocław, had been cultivating his garden since 1966. At that time, he worked at the machine factory in town. At the time of our conversation, he had been long since retired, was in his 80s, and came to the garden 7 days a week. Pani Zosia, an allotment gardener in Poznan, received her allotment from her mother-in-law 20 years ago. So people really had these for decades. The range of activities necessary to tend the garden can keep people at their allotments and away from their homes for long stretches of time. The long Polish summer days mean that some are at their gardens for over 12 hours a day. Pani Zosia spent hours at her allotment. During a conversation with several of her fellow gardeners at this allotment on the outskirts of Poznan, while sharing plates of cheesecake and cake with fruit gelatin, one woman stated, "I'm at my allotment garden from morning to night and don't want to return to the house." Pani Zosia responded, "What is there to do at home? What do you do at home? What do you do in the apartment building?" "What is there to do at home?" said the first woman. "I don't like not doing anything." Then answering her own question, Pani Zosia said, "What do? You snooze, you have lunch, you smell the neighbors cooking," as a description of daily life in her apartment. "I escaped from the commotion," remarked the third woman, whose apartment building was on a busy street. In contrast, they described the feeling of being in nature that came from being at the garden, including the sounds of birds like jays and owls and starlings which land on cherry trees, and the sights of animals like foxes and wild boars. Another gardener, Pan Bogdan, boasted of the beauty of the flowers in his garden. He pointed out the beautiful hollyhock plants in several allotments, noting that this has a folkloristic quality that makes it, quote, "our flower." Although most gardeners I met had more space dedicated for vegetables, flowers featured prominently at many gardens. Pan Bogdan remarked, "Flowers enliven the gardens. If there are no flowers, the garden is sad." In addition to producing healthy food, the garden also helps sustain health. Pani Zosia had a friend who used a cane to walk, but didn't need it in the garden. Another remarked, "Gardens are medicine." Although he was reticent about the details, Pan Lech described his long struggle with cancer and credited his garden with his continued survival. "I'm alive thanks to my garden," he said. Although he experienced pain from his cancer treatments, he noted that he was at the allotment daily from 9 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., and that the time flew by. As we spoke in the main administrative building, Pan Lech tinkered with a broken light fixture, twisting and untwisting wires, screwing and unscrewing a light bulb in efforts to repair it. By caring for the plants, the infrastructure, and the social life of the allotment gardens, Pan Lech cared for himself. These entwinements of material and social relations structured the rhythms of his days as they had for decades. The nation came to matter at the garden as well. The values and priorities of allotment gardening for Pan Zbyszek were fundamentally Polish. As soon as he learned that I was interested in allotment gardens, he declared that these are so popular in Poland because of the Polish desire for having one's own property, własność. Unlike those Tsarists to the east, meaning the Russians, Pan Zbyszek described Poles as needing their own property and land. By referring to Russians as Tsarists, Pan Zbyszek was using terminology that was accurate during the partition era in Poland, when part of what is now Poland was ruled by the Russian Empire. This language also implicitly recalled Polish histories of relations to the land, because the socialist state never fully collectivized agriculture in Poland. For Pan Zbyszek, his contemporary practices of gardening were connected to the pre-socialist history of the Polish nation. Finally, there is a vital sociality to gardening, evident in the flowers that gave life to Pan Bogdan's garden and the gardens that gave life to Pan Lech himself. This vitality stems from a sociality that connects persons, places, and times across scales. So I'll close with a few remarks on the broader implications of this book. First, this book shows how everyday social practices can shape moral personhood in ways that are different from normative binary understandings of old age. This could have implications for social policies. Second, this book shows that using categories other than the biomedical can shed new perspectives on experiences of aging, working towards this comparative and expansive gerontological imaginary. Additionally, by highlighting these practices of sociality concerning relatedness and care, the book highlights aspects of continuity across lifetimes and eras, even in this region that has witnessed and endured so much violence and rupture. One primary way these continuities emerge is through the historical romantic imaginary of the Polish nation, which shapes a shared framework within which older Poles can create social relations, practice aktywność, or come to be seen by others as respected elders. So this lens also offers a different perspective on the contemporary political situation in Poland, in which older people who support the conservative nationalism of the Law and Justice Party, which mobilizes and promotes this romantic national imagery towards exclusivist ends, can be dismissed as irrelevant, backward, or out of touch. By considering how the myth of the romantic Polish nation comes to matter in the lives of older Poles, it becomes possible to develop more nuanced explanations of support for such right-wing policies. But it's also not the case that all older Poles who connect to this romantic national imaginary support such conservative parties and policies. Indeed, some older Poles who made this person-nation connection most strongly were supporters of the center-right party, largely due to its pro-EU leanings. So this shows the dynamism of such person-nation connections. As the population ages, the people who have firsthand experience of events that have been so significant to romantic Polish national mythology are shrinking in number. Indeed, the oldest people whose stories appeared in this book were small children during the partition era and young adults during World War II. Since the time of my fieldwork, they and others have died. Current centenarians in Poland were born during the interwar period, lived their childhood and adolescence during World War II, and young adulthood in the early socialist years. As each subsequent generation ages and eventually passes away, how do the stakes of remembering, relatedness, and moral personhood shift? As firsthand experience of events with such cultural and political significance disappears, how will this transformation in forms of knowledge shape personal, kin, and transnational relations in politics? I don't mean for these questions to motivate a sort of salvage attitude towards studying older people, but rather to explore how memory and relationality might shape moral personhood for generations that have not yet reached the so-called third and fourth ages. Tracing these connections between the life course of persons and nations at both experiential and imaginative levels reveals the spatio-temporal elements that shape the sociality of life itself. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you to all the research participants and funders. And I look forward to your questions and comments and to Sarah's comments as well. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jess. And I'll start off by asking a few questions, making a few more brief comments, and then anyone who would like to would welcome the audience's participation. So you could raise your hand. You could, I see one already raised, so that's great, or a clapping. Yeah, so feel free to raise your hand, put a comment in the chat too. And the questions can be big and fancy, or they can be, you know, just, you know, how did you do this, etc. So feel free to participate in whichever way you would like. So thank you so much. One thing that I think a really important, maybe broader policy implication for your book and the arguments you just laid out have to do with ways that we think about interacting with people with dementia and how Alzheimer's daycare centers might work, et cetera. So one thing that you didn't describe in great detail right now, you can't cover everything in your presentation, but that your book, that her chapter 5 of her book is called Rethinking Memory, Everyday Rhythms of Dementia, and focuses on people in a dementia daycare center. And one of the really, I think, really fascinating things you found, just that it has broader relevance, is how the individuals, as we all know, many people with dementia don't have a hard time remembering and talking about details of their own personal biographies, things that might have happened more recently, or things that are happening right now in the present, like who is the leader right now, or, you know, when did you marry? But it was striking how the people collectively could remember together things about their nation's history as a whole. And so this is one way that just shows the dynamism of the person-nation connection. So people could sing together songs that were popular when they were younger, or they might remember better some ruler and politicians that were active in the, let's say, socialist era than what are happening right now. So she argues how this sense of participating in the shared history of the collective nation helped them also feel connected to each other socially right now. So that was a part of this moral personhood idea of being a valued and socially connected person right now through, you know, memories of the past. So I guess you could, I don't, how did you discover this? Was this obvious that that these kinds of collective memories of the past works better than focusing on individual narratives of people in the present? And do you think that your finding can have broader implications for the ways people imagine how to engage most productively in conversations with older people, or how to arrange dementia care centers?
Thank you so much for that question, Sarah. Yeah, you're right. I didn't really get into the dementia chapter in this particular presentation, so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it at this time. It actually did come out as pretty striking early on in the fieldwork that the national past, regional and national past mattered. I mean, in a couple of the particular field site, maybe to say just a bit more about that for context, was a day center for people with supposedly early stages of Alzheimer's and dementia, but because Alzheimer's is often not diagnosed until later in Poland. That's what people were telling me. And again, this was research done 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, most of it. By the time people sought help, they were often at more advanced stages, and so not actually in the early stages. And so these were people who could, carry on conversations, but the conversations were not often grounded in the here and now. Some people were not able to participate verbally, but some people did have, and so, but you could tell people were still paying attention through other forms and communicating in other ways. There are a lot of dramatic facial expressions. Physical activities would draw people out in ways that some conversations wouldn't. And so I just was really struck by some of the activities that the therapists would engage people in were very focused on collective type things. So for example, there is one activity of name a city in Poland that begins with every letter of the alphabet, and the whole group of about 20 people would collectively generate an alphabet full of list of Polish towns and villages. The therapist would also though ask questions like, what was the happiest time in your life? Or talk about the most important or meaningful time in your life. And conversation would just shut down. There are a couple really talkative people, and so they would just often speak up, but no one else would contribute. In some ways it was it was an ethnographic moment that was felt very similar to teaching in some ways, where you're paying attention to who's speaking and who's not speaking, and what kinds of ways can you encourage other forms of participation. So I think there might be a way that kind of a teacherly ethos and an ethnographic ethos in that context could maybe draw out that insight. But I just really noticed that hey, the dynamics of this group change a lot. The mood changes across the day, people's participation changes across the day. So what's happening in those moments in which there's a lot of excitement? And it was at the kind of things that could bring people together. And I think it has to do, I think it perhaps has to do is with the fact that, if you can't remember the happiest part of your life, or you can say it was my wedding or it was my child's graduation, but that's all you can say, that feels really bad to not be able to provide that detail, or to have someone prompt you with, tell me about your children, and you can't. That the stakes of that are really, really different than the stakes of kind of lighthearted joking or chit chat about places that people know and things like that. So I think it's a question, I think it's an open-ended question of how broadly this is applicable in other contexts, since I think the ways that people come to relate to Poland in particular is distinct to that place in time. But I do think that the insight that collective that meaningful forms of collectivity can be an important mode of engagement for people with dementia, can be pulled out of that for therapeutic contexts.
Yeah, really important and interesting. Well, since Poland is so important to your book and even your interpretation of these meaningful forms of collectivity, can I ask you to share with us how you ended up becoming interested in Poland in particular? And yeah, just a little bit of the story of all anthropologists choose one place at first, at least, to really concentrate on, and then they often branch out to other places later. But you could just tell a little bit of the story of your relationship to Poland.
Yes, thank you for that question. So as always, there's kind of the official and unofficial stories of that. I guess what I'll say here is that I started off being interested in aging and personhood and thinking with memory across scales. And I was really influenced by Lawrence Cohen's work in India about the ways that changes in India have transformed how people make sense of changes in late life. And so I was kind of casting about for a part of the world that would be an interesting place to answer that question. And students do as I say, not as I do in this instance a little bit, because I was, well, I don't know, maybe that's not fair. I guess I would say that I knew that as an anthropologist, there is more funding available to you if you do work in parts of the world that are not the US and not Western Europe. And so I was particularly looking for parts of the world that would give me more access to funding for this research. I also thought, kind of naively, and this is naive, that this was quite naive, that, oh, if I go somewhere different, it'll be easier to see differences because or to make sense of cultural patterns because I'll have to be learning things. And I also got interested in this project because my own grandmother had Alzheimer's for a couple decades, and so I thought, oh, maybe if I'm elsewhere, it won't feel quite so personal. But of course, that was a long time ago now, and I still have very strong connections to Poland, and over time they become more personal, so you cannot actually escape that personal work. But then what really drew me to Poland in particular is that this was in 2004 when I was beginning graduate school and beginning this project, was that Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic and Slovakia had joined the EU that year. And so I was really just truly reading a lot about that part of the world and thinking, oh my gosh, this is a fascinating place to think about age and memory and transformation. And generation gaps are just such a kind of obvious, I mean, they were obvious even in reading the American press on that part of the world and joining the EU then. And so I thought that could be a really potentially productive place to think about transformations in personhood and memory across scale. It was also, Eastern Europe is also a particular place where memory is a big topic in everyday life. The politics of memory are, I mean, at the time when I chose it, I didn't quite actually know how good a topic it was, but I had some sense that there was just a lot of cultural activity around memory, and I wanted to understand that. And then the practicalities of why Poland, as opposed to another country, were actually the reasons for that were actually extremely practical. That I had decided to do graduate work at the University of Michigan, which has this fantastic program in Polish studies, and so a lot of resources to help me learn what I needed to learn. But I think that I'm sure you could ask similar questions in any of those countries and find interesting answers. But I think the way that the Polish romantic national myth looms so large in everyday life and has been mobilized over decades makes Poland a really interesting place to think about personal and national kinds of connections.
Really interesting. Thank you. Let me, at my last kind of question for now, or comment, or I'll about to do, and then so the rest of the audience start thinking about what you would like to ask. I wanted to share a passage from one of Jess Robbins' chapters that focuses on the experiences of both receiving and giving care in a long-term care facility. And this is in a section. She also has really nice, actually, section headings that draw the reader in. This one is called Diapers and Feeding, the Repetitive Intimacy of Caring Relations. And as part of Jess's field work, well, she had hung out here for a while talking with the various older people who live there, and she decided that she would really like to shadow one of the nurses' aides that cares for people. And so she followed one nurse's aide around for the whole day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. as she cared for people, bathing and cleaning and toileting and feeding, and then putting them to bed again at the end of the day. Jess, at the end of this section, sums up. She says, "This was a long, tiring day full of repetitive, difficult tasks, moving parts of bodies that were in pain, turning patients to prevent bed sores, changing diapers that sometimes even became soiled during the changing process. There were intense and often unpleasant odors. Pani Kassia was not paid well for her work. Several staff I knew at the center would work extra hours to make ends meet. Despite these long hours and low pay, Pani Kassia expressed a satisfaction in her job that came from helping others. She took pride in being able to connect with patients that others might dismiss." I'm skipping a little bit here. "There were indeed moments of frustration, sadness, shame, and pain, but there were also moments of connection, empathy, tenderness, and humor." So again, this going beyond the binary of good versus bad aging. "Many interactions were about suffering, but some were equally about hope. I point this out not to minimize the very real suffering that these patients endured, or to defend the difficult working conditions of medical personnel in Poland, but rather to highlight the moments of intimacy in which patients and staff engage. Such intimacy can be difficult or disgusting, but it can also be personal and constitutive. These older people were not being taken care of by their families, but they were not abandoned either. Patients became part of the small-scale sociality and daily rhythms of the institution. Indeed, this rehabilitation center was a site for the production of intimate, small-scale relations made possible through a cyclical temporality." That was just one of many passages that I love that convey the intimacy and richness of your detailed field work with your insightful interpretations. So let's see, does anyone from the audience, would you like to make a comment or ask a question? Yes, Stephen, why don't you unmute yourself? And great.
Hey, Jess, thanks so much for this. So, I mean, I feel like we've talked about a million things over the years, but in hearing this today, I was really struck by the thought that the folks who you've been working with would have lived through really dramatic changes in fertility rate and birth rate over their lives, like from the time when they were born, where Poland would have had really a very, very high birth rate, to now, as I understand it, one of the lowest in Europe, certainly sub-replacement level. And I was just wondering how that affects how they think about, you know, the fact that they have fewer grandchildren than their grandparents had, and sort of how the kind of, because there's on the one hand, there's the political awareness of like fertility rate and how that affects the economy and all that kind of big macro level stuff. But then there's got to be micro stuff going on, right? About how like, what does that mean for my life? And the fact that either my grandkids don't exist because I don't have as many, or they don't live in Poland, right? Because they're in England or wherever they've gone to. And how does that all play out in when you're talking to people?
Thanks so much for that question, Steve. That's totally a great question and insight. And yes, absolutely. It is definitely true that fertility patterns and birth rates have changed dramatically during the lifetimes of the oldest generations. As you said, people there's a, certainly since Poland has joined the EU in 2004, there's been a very large out-migration of Poles to the UK and Germany, notably. However, it's also not new that people have been migrating out from Poland. The Polish diaspora, Polonia, is almost, one estimate is that it's 20 million people, half the population of Poles as the country of Poland. But people do definitely experience it as a kind of a lament of, there's partially a lament of people of my family is geographically far away. So people definitely lament the grandkids being in the UK and Germany, although there is also a sense of pride, especially with the migration to the UK and Germany in some cases, for people who are proud that Poland is part of the European Union, and that's seen as like a step, can be seen as a step of progress, although of course in reality what those working conditions are like in Germany and the UK is often quite poor. And so there's, as is often the case with many experiences of migration, right? There's like aspirations for the better future, but you have to really, those aspirations are not matched with everyday life experiences. What I would also say is there's a lot of migration, a lot more movement within Poland now too. So it's not only external migration, but people are moving from, notably, certainly from villages to cities. And actually I see on the call a former Wayne State student, Anna Zawicka, looking at this, looking at in Latvia at older adults in rural areas, that there's the rural areas in Poland are certainly having a lot of outmigration of younger people. But even for older adults in the cities, which is where my fieldwork was, people would move from Wrocław to Warsaw for work, which in the US context is not far, but in a Polish context, it's very far. And given how slowly the trains run and the conditions of some of the roads, it does take quite a long time. So I would say that there is a lament, but there's kind of a sense of a lament and a progress at this same time, because there's also a movement away from agricultural work to other types of labor, industrial, post-industrial, office kinds of labor as well. And so there's shifts in ideals of the family too. So people, I think, have complex ideas about what families are supposed to look like. There's also I won't go into it because it's a whole other thing, but the Polish government is also trying to encourage, it also has a bunch of pronatalist policies to work against this very below replacement birth rate that is to try to counter the obvious answer to this, which is immigration from other places, which is also happening quite problematically and dramatically at this very moment. But yeah, I would say it's this kind of complex sense of lament, lament and progress at the same time.
Thank you. Let me ask another question and then feel free to raise your hand in the audience. I was wondering, I remember I was trying to search for it and I couldn't find it exactly. Sometimes in the book we talk about how Catholicism makes an impact perhaps on the way people think about aging and care and frailty. And I guess most people in Poland now, both caregivers, family members, and the older people themselves you've dealt with are Catholic. Did you see, do you think that that the Catholic lens does tend to emphasize more of an acceptance of frailty, decline, that no one can live forever, death, than perhaps if they weren't Catholic. I'm thinking partly of Anna Corwin's work, as you know, in focusing on US Catholic nuns who really seem to be very well accepting of that aging and dying and frailty are a normal part of the human condition. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the role of Catholicism in your work in Poland.
Yes, very much so. Thank you for that question. So yes, I think similar to Anna Corwin's work, there is kind of a broad acceptance of suffering and frailty or disability and bodily changes at the end of life. For instance, Pope John Paul II, the Polish Pope, lived well into his 80s, and you know, the Catholic Church itself was very, like, did not hide that away. If you look at images of John Paul II at the end of his life, he was still doing what he could do, even as he was quite weakened by the diseases of his late life. So certainly the Catholic Church proper very much values, like, that sense of valuing human life at all of its stages is there. And I think certainly at one of my field sites was a rehabilitation center run by an order of Catholic nuns. And so they very much would articulate that as well. I think some of my research participants also would, some older Poles would too, but then they would also be really frustrated with their own physical disabilities or their own changing bodies and minds and capabilities. So it was kind of a coexistence of, like, yes, I do accept this in one sense, but also the changes can be difficult, I think, in part because there's not, you know, people, at least in the rehabilitation center, they didn't want to be, most of them did not want to be in the rehabilitation center. They wanted to be home being cared for by kin, but there's not resources and practicalities to make that possible. So there's kind of a mismatch between ideals and experiences again. Also at that rehab center, what I would say though is that the Catholic nature of it meant that there was a small chapel there. Although the state-run place had a small chapel as well. And so that the ability to continue to participate in going to chapel daily was very meaningful for many older Poles. And in fact, it's something that they wouldn't be able to do if they were living at home, probably. But the fact that they could wheel down the hallway made it actually quite accessible. So it did provide another a kind of a, I don't know, paradox is not quite the right word, but it shows the complexity of institutional life.
Thank you. You're so good at pointing out the nuances and complexity of nothing is simple. Elizabeth, Professor Lublin, you should go next. You and unmute yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. So I was curious. I mean, you had mentioned early on.
Oh no, the internet.
Oh,
I think it's better now.
Is it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
Oh, sorry. My internet has been glitchy for a little bit, so I apologize on this. So I was wondering, again, because most of your interviewees were women, if you could talk about the ways in maybe gender and class, if there are any distinctions that you've come across that have shaped your research.
Yes. Thank you very much for that question, Betsy. So yes, I at the medical and educational institutions where I did my fieldwork, there were over 80%, actually I think over 90% of my participants there were women. And at the rehab center, it was constantly over 70% there who are women. And at the universities of the third age, the educational context nationally in Poland, those are like over 85% women. So I would ask people about this. And at the for their own kind of, to understand their folk kind of like their own understandings of these gender differences. And because although it's true that that women do live longer than men, it's not so dramatic that 80% of the population over 65 is female. That's not true. And so the explanations I would get for people were along the following lines. At the rehab center, I would ask why it's so many women, and people would tell me, well, men don't get rehab because they just die of heart attacks or strokes. They don't survive the event, which is there's some truth to some of that. They would also say, well, if they do survive, they're not strong enough. Rehab is really hard. Men are weak. Old men are weak. Women are strong enough to do rehab. At the universities of the third age, people would say, well, that's because women are active. Women are active. They've been active their whole lives. They're active in the world of people and social relations, where men are involved in the world of things. And it was one of those ethnographic moments where I was like, oh, I've really found something here, because it was a summer I had gone back for some follow-up work, and I was really trying to find the men. And I kept asking, really pushing people on this. And I heard in a bunch of different contexts, like women belong to the world of people and men belong to the world of things. And I was like, all right, thank you for just repeating this. I now have, that is a real ethnographic finding right there. Thank you. And so I started asking, where are the older men? And people would tell me, well, they're either at their allotment gardens, which is how I started going there, or watching soccer, or they're tinkering, repairing things, or fishing, but kind of not engaged in this world of other people and interpersonal relations. So there's definitely a gendered kind of ideology of what older men are like and what older women are like. So in the allotment gardens, part of what made those places so ethnographically interesting is that they really are a place of mixed gender sociality in ways that the educational and medical institutions aren't. They also, in terms of class, I would say, so at the universities of the third age, the people who attend those are people, at least at the two places where I was, which were in relatively big cities in Poland, the fourth and fifth biggest cities in the country. And these universities of the third age exist in small towns as well. And there's quite a lot of variation in how they're set up. The one in Wrocław was actually affiliated with the University of Wrocław, so it was very academic in character. But you can imagine, it was the people who participated there were mostly people who were retired teachers, lawyers, bankers, engineers, not so much farmers or factory workers, which is kind of what you would expect of something called a university. Who is that going to appeal to? And people with either who had some sort of, I mean, white collar is not quite the right word, but some sort of like white collar class labor history or aspirations. And one of the interesting things that I found, and there's a really fantastic book by Longina Jakubowska that I'm blanking on the name of, maybe one of my Polish studies colleagues here could tell me that, remind me of it, about the endurance of the importance of the noble class in Poland despite 60 years of state socialism. So it is still very much known, if you have a noble last name in Poland or a peasant last name, the distinction between nobility and peasant is still quite meaningful for people. And so people who have some sort of connection to past nobility, for instance, their University of the Third Age participation often slots into that kind of historical sense. But I guess what I would say across the different kinds of across the differences in class, because some at the rehab institution and the state-run social welfare institution where I did field work, people there were really were more, yes, the Schlachter, yes, John, thank you. I was thinking of Longina Jakubowska's book, I can't remember the name of it, about the nobility, but at the medical institutions, people there had a much more diverse class backgrounds. There were farmers, there were people who had been formerly unhoused. And what was so striking was that really this kind of persistence of the person-nation connection across these gendered and class variations that existed in the work.
Thank you. We have a question and comment, an interesting one in the chat, also from Stacy Markle. This gender equation of women as strength, activity, and people versus men as weak and things seems like a reversal of typical gender ideologies. Maybe the way, at least reversal of how we might think of typical in the US. Did you find that these people thought this way all their lives? Or did they transition to this way of thinking over time and aging?
So that is a great question. Thank you, Stacy. It is quite notable, and I would say that it doesn't, that equation doesn't quite capture the whole picture. So it is also certainly the case that Polish men are thought of as, you know, maybe what you might think of as like in an American sense, as like the classic male breadwinner type strong person, but who is particularly kind of not capable in some ways often around domestic space. So there's shifting there's shifting ways that gender differences come to matter, and that gendered meanings come to matter, so that like the home is women's space, the public sphere is men's space, and so it's not so much that it transitions over a lifetime, but rather that it transitions by context. I think is the answer there. Yeah.
Thank you. And I see we have a question from Alana.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for that fantastic presentation. I so appreciate the nuanced ways that you're connecting older Poles' experiences and practices of memory and nation and personhood. And I wonder if your analysis and your experiences there, you know, how does that analysis help us understand some of the political shifts that have happened in Poland since you were in the field? Or do you think of those, like, do you understand those shifts through these lenses, or is there a better way to think about it? And maybe like how do you think about what has changed in Poland?
Yeah, and thanks for that question, Alana. I think, so the political changes in Poland since I have been there are, in short, it has become much farther, it has moved much farther to the right. Just one way to put it in very few words. And so in some ways, I think that this is, I don't have like the explanation for it. I think that the ways that the Law and Justice Party is able to mobilize a sense of the Polish nation as opposed to the other has been really important in increasing their power. I think that it's also important for us to note that although many older people do support this group, it is not solely older people. And that's one of the things that I've actually felt very strongly early in my work, is that younger people in Poland were actually super dismissive of older people as like backwards and out of touch. And, you know, oh, they support like these far right people and they say racist and some anti-Semitic stuff, and they're so like out of touch and stuck in the past. But who are the people in like marching in neo-Nazi rallies, it is not only old people. It's not mostly old people. Like, so age is not a sufficient explanation for the changes that are happening. But I would say that the way that the myth of the Polish nation is, as this romantic national myth, is a fundamentally exclusivist one, which is different than other historical versions of the Polish nation, both its imagination and its realities. I think that the exclusionary nature of national belonging that they're promoting is very much part of the continued support for this party, increasing support for this party.
Thank you. Lauren Hayes has a question or a comment.
Hi, Jess. Thank you for that talk. I really liked some of the stories too about these kind of descriptions of them, sort of what they do all day, like being bored and going to their garden and talking about what else is there to do. Sorry, I have a noisy dog in the background here and a baby, so there might be some distraction. But anyway, regarding that, this is sort of following up on some of the gendered things that people were talking about with gendered roles. And I'm curious, like, how much a part of their lives, like reproductive labor is, are any of the, particularly because the majority of your informants were women, like how, is caring for grandchildren a part of that? And does that sort of change their idea about like aging and usefulness? Because the garden seems to be like a big kind of useful behavior and something to do. And I wondered how much family was a part of that too.
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Lauren. Absolutely. So there is a phrase that people repeated to me that I heard many times, that grandparents, sometimes it was grandmothers, are the treasure of the Polish nation. And that was often said in reference to childcare labor. So the people at the universities of the third age pretty much only came to the university of the third age after their grandkids had gotten older and were in school. So they are very, very, very much involved in reproductive labor that shapes their experiences of old age. That was not, it's both exciting, but also it feels like a curse of doing ethnographic work. As I wanted to see all of I was really trying hard to kind of document a range of experiences to work against the kinds of assumptions that we can build into about what one version or another of old age is like. And I never spent time with Polish grandparents caring for their grandkids, which is probably like the most common experience of older people's life in Poland. So that's all to say, yes, and I don't have the data on it, and I wish I did. But your question is totally right on.
Thank you.
We have, I see we have one more question from John Bugowicz. Sorry about my pronunciation. And then I'll ask one final brief question after that, and then it's almost time to close out. But John, why didn't you please go ahead? And you have to unmute.
Oops. Thanks, Sarah. And that's either Bukowczyk or Bukowczyk.
Okay, thanks.
Not Bukowicz.
Okay, sorry.
You sound like my dismissive and ill-informed students. I really enjoyed your talk, Jess. It really a very fascinating, interesting subject. And I had a couple of questions. One of them is just really simple little question, and the other one's a little more complicated. I'm curious in the first instance, how large these allotments are in these community gardens. And then in the second instance, I'm also curious if you had located your research in a more remote place like Eastern Poland or Southeastern Poland. I'm curious what you think might have been the differences in what you might have found in those places which are very rural and sort of like frozen in time in a lot of respects, places that time is forgotten in a sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions, John. Yes, so how large the allotments are, I don't have the measurements off the top of my head. I don't remember, but they are quite large. They are large enough to have a small house on them, which, depending on the rules of the particular allotment, you are or are not allowed to sleep there, but people do anyway. And these small houses have like one room and a bathroom and sometimes a shower. So it's like a big shed kind of, and then there's enough space for you know, a dozen fruit trees and several large plots of produce. I mean, people could really live off of the food produced in this garden. One interesting thing about these gardens is that the younger people, because there are younger people who are now taking up allotment gardening as like a cool hip thing to do, and the older people will tell me, oh, you can tell that garden is a younger person's garden because it's all a lawn, like it's a działka rekreacyjna, it's a recreational space. They just make it into a lawn to hang out. They don't like cultivate it in the right way. But if it were a lawn, you would have enough. You could get a good volleyball game going on there. They're pretty good size. And then yes, of course in Poland, the east-west distinction is huge and the urban-rural distinction is huge. So I think I would still find actually perhaps even more pronounced connections between the person and the nation. I think the particular regional histories would matter differently in a way similar to how the history of Wrocław and Poznan are quite different. So people in Wrocław would tell me stories about the lost city of Lwów, the former eastern end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that Galicia, that was a very beloved place in the Polish nation. And people in Poznan, on the other hand, had lived, Poznan is the seat of the original Polish royalty, Mieszko I, etc. And so people there have a long, deep history to that particular place. And so I think that the regional differences and the regional stories that I would hear in southern and southeastern Poland would be quite different. But I imagine that the national would continue to be important in some ways. Maybe depending on where the region might even supersede the nation. Certainly in the Tatras, that could be the case where there's such a strong local identity. So I could imagine perhaps that the local might even rise above the level of the nation.
Really
but I think that everyday practices would remain. I think they would remain actually quite similar.
So interesting. And I would love one of those allotment gardens for myself. So our time is almost up. So I don't, Jess, would you be able to, a lot of us would love to know what to look out for in your next book. Would you be able to give us the 1-minute version of one of your next projects?
Yes, so I guess most related, I have a bunch of things I'm cooking up, but I would say most related to what I've been talking about today is a deeper dive into the histories of active aging through looking at the histories of the universities of the third age. As I mentioned, they've actually been around for a long time, and some of the founders of those have very interesting life histories. Going back to the partition era, and were very active in the founding of the fields of social work and pedagogy in Poland, which were connected to the Polish national movements during the partition era. And I think, so I'm trying to build out an ethnographically grounded intellectual history of the aging subject and of the category of activity through looking at the formation of the intellectual fields on which the universities of the third age are based. And so that spans both. Ideally, I would also know Russian and German to do this project most fully, but I don't, so I'll have to limit myself to the Polish sources there. But yeah,
wow, thank you.
That's one thing that's
so much.
next.
I'll turn it over to Elizabeth Levelin to close us out, but let me just, if anyone hasn't bought or purchased the book yet, I guess it's looking blurry, sorry. Here we go. It's a beautiful book also. This has been my pleasure to participate, and let me turn it over to Elizabeth for closing words.
Yes, thank you for showing the cover of the book. If you get a chance, there is a discount coupon or code that is available through Rutgers University Press. Otherwise, Jess, thank you very much for that that snapshot, so to speak, that quick introduction to the next project, something definitely to look forward to. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you, Sarah, for leading us through the discussion today and providing some context and some comments about your evaluation of the book and its historiographical significance. And thank you, everyone, for joining. It's been a delight. One of the things I most enjoy about these book launches is it takes me out of my own field, introduces me to the broader humanistic scholarship out there. So again, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest. So I hope to see you there.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Bethany.
Thank you, Jess.
I decided just to stay on to say goodbye, but anyway, fun. And it looks like
thank you so much, Sarah.
And so, yeah, I really apologize I shouldn't have tried to pronounce John's last name. I don't know any Polish.
It's okay.
Anyway, that was
That's
really fun. It was great to hear you talk about your work, and just congratulations.
Thank you so much for those comments. It was really helpful it was really fun and interesting to see it through your eyes too. So I really appreciate that and taking the time to do so. And Betsy, again, thank you so much for hosting all of this.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I appreciate both of you for all you put into this. Wonderful PowerPoint. And Sarah, I definitely appreciate your sort of manning the Q&A. I find when this is outside of my field, having somebody in the field.
It's harder. Yeah.
Definitely helps.
Yeah.
But,
good. Okay.
Thank you both.
Okay.
Let's stay in touch, Jess. And
yeah, sounds good. Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.